Good morning, boys and girls. I'm Mr. Chris. Welcome to Kids Time, and today we have another lesson for you about David. Before we get into our lesson, I thought that today we could do a short review and just remind ourselves of the colors that we've talked about over the past couple of weeks and what they mean to us. First of all, we talked about the color purple, and we said that was the color of royalty. David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. And on a more personal level, we talked about how God has a plan for each one of us. Doesn't matter if you're old or young, big or small, God has a plan for you. The next week, we talked about the color gray. And we talked about how there are times when we're all sad, depressed, lonely. And, God doesn't like it when we're sad and lonely, so he brings people into our lives. We have friends that help cheer us up, and in return, we can cheer up our friends, just like David cheered up Saul when he was sad. Last week with Mr. Brick, you talked about the color brown, and you talked about how God has promised to help us no matter what he has asked us to do. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. God has promised to help us accomplish whatever he has asked us to do. That can be, fighting a 10-foot tall giant, or it could be saying, I'm sorry to mom and dad when we, take an extra cookie from the cookie jar. This week we have another color, and I bet you're thinking that it's going to be, red or blue, maybe yellow, orange. Well, it's not. This week we're talking about the color green. Now, I know most of you, when we say the color green, you think about springtime. You think about the grass growing, trees blooming, flowers. You think about life. Green does represent life. And it also represents things like if you see a green light at the intersection, it means it's time to go. It's time to move ahead with a project. Adults use big words like green light when it comes to doing something at work, doing a new project. Green can also mean, it's not a bad thing, but it can mean like somebody is inexperienced. Right now we're hoping that football starts in a few weeks. And there are some players for the 49ers that are going to be called or be told that they are green. It just means that they're new to the team. Maybe they're new to the NFL. They're inexperienced, and players on the other team will pick on them. They'll try to, run past them. They'll try to throw the ball, over them. So green can mean a lot of good things, and then, green can also mean some not so good things. And today we're talking about a really big, not so good thing, and that is called envy. Envy is when you want something that somebody else has. It could be, you want a swimming pool because your best friend has a swimming pool. It could be, you want to go watch this movie because your older brother or sister gets to see it. Mom and dad say no to you, and now you're envious of your sibling. It could be, that your upset because a friend made the football team or the basketball team and you didn't. Envy affects all of us. Today we're going to see how it affected Saul and David, and then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about what we can do to not be envious and to not hurt ourselves or others by being envious. Today, our passage from the Bible comes from 1 Samuel chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 6, and it says, "As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s.' And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed 1,000. And what more can he have but the kingdom?' And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. And he did that as he did that day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear at David, for he thought, 'I will pin him to the wall.' Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. So Saul removed David from his presence and made him a commander over 1,000 men. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of David. But all of Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them." Who are we talking about today? We're talking about David and Saul. Saul is once again upset at David. You see, this story takes place right after David killed Goliath. It says in verse 6 that they're going home from the battlefield. So David had just killed Goliath. Saul thought all of the people would be happy and cheer for him. After all, he's the king, he's the leader of the army. But what happened? All of the people cheered for David. The ladies in all of the cities said, Saul, he's a good warrior. He's, let's say, killed 1,000 people. He really hadn't, but he's a good guy. David, on the other hand, he's a great warrior. He's killed 10,000 people. He's 10 times the warrior or the person that Saul is. And that made Saul really angry. It says in verse 9, verse 8, that Saul says, "What more can David have than my kingdom?" Saul was that frustrated with David. David had, in his eyes, taken away everything but his throne. And this wasn't just in one place. This was all over Israel. And it made Saul so mad that, what does it say? The next day he threw a spear at David, and it wasn't just a little toss to see if he could, stick it into the ground right in front of David. He threw it at him hard enough to As Saul said, he wanted to pin him to the wall. He wanted to kill David. Fortunately, he missed. And then Saul decides just to send David away. He'll make David like a general in his army. He'll put him in charge of a group of men and let David go off, fight the enemy. Maybe the enemy will kill him since Saul didn't. But at least David will be out of Saul's presence. And David was fine with that. David would never intentionally hurt King Saul. He wasn't trying to kill him. He wasn't trying to take over his throne. David was fine in obeying Saul's commands. So he went out and became the best leader, the best general that he could. Saul should have been happy for David. After all, David had won a great victory for his army. He should have been happy. Instead, he was envious. He hated David. And that envy ended up in the long run costing Saul his kingdom. It cost Saul his life. It cost Saul's son Jonathan, David's best friend, his life. It caused him nothing but problems. So boys and girls, in conclusion, let me tell you, envy does nothing but ruin friendships and relationships. Yes, you may want, the same video games, the same toys, the same phone, the same stuff that your friends have. You may want to buy your clothes at the same stores. But being envious of what they have can and probably will cost you their friendship. You can want to make the basketball team, but if you don't, it's not worth losing a friend over. Be happy for what your friends have, for what they do, for what they can do. Don't be bitter about it like Saul was. God has blessed each one of us. You may not think so, but you have been blessed by God. We all have reasons to be thankful. When we're done here today, I would like you to sit down and think of 10 things that you're thankful for. And, while we're all thankful for our moms and dads and brothers and sisters and maybe our pets and, that places that we've been to, try to think of 8 things that you're thankful for that, that you really have to think about. Maybe for the neighbor that brought you a special birthday present. Maybe for your teacher that cares about you, even if they haven't seen you yet. Think of some things that you've been blessed with that, you really have to think about. Remember, the only cure for envy is for you to be thankful. And that is it.